Okay, just while everyone takes their seats. Hello, welcome to the Library Museum. My name's Anne-Marie, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wiradjuri people and pay respect to elders past, present and future, for they hold the memories, culture, traditions and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that contribute to our community. Respect to any First Nations people here tonight. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this event. Thank you all for coming along tonight. And I'm so pleased to welcome our panel of guests who've travelled from Melbourne and Sydney today to share readings and reflections from the recently published anthology, Nothing to Hide. I am going to hand you over to Yves Rees to introduce everyone and steer the event. So first I will introduce Yves. Yves is an historian and lecturer in history at La Trobe Uni and co-host of the podcast Archive Fever with historian Claire Wright. And Yves is also one of the co-editors of the anthology. Thank you, Yves.
Hey. Thanks, Anne-Marie, for that really warm and generous introduction, and thank you all for coming. As Anne-Marie said, I was at WAM last year and I recognised a few faces from people who I met then, and it was, I did quite a number of writers' festivals last year touring my memoir, but WAM was definitely the highlight because there was just such appreciative audiences and a really wonderful community vibe, so it's a real pleasure to be back. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on stolen land. We're on the land of the Wiradjuri people, and I'd like to acknowledge Indigenous elders, past and present, as well as any Indigenous people who might be here today. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So we've got a kind of mixed program prepared for you this evening. We've got my co-editor Sam here tonight, as well as three amazing contributors who I'll introduce in a moment. The contributors are all going to do a short reading from their piece in this anthology. Then we're going to have a bit of a discussion between ourselves about the anthology and trans writing, trans culture, and then we'd really love to hear from you. So start thinking of your questions because we'd really love to make this as interactive as possible. But first I thought I'd just give you a bit of an introduction into what this book is all about. So it's, I'm one of 4 editors who put this together, along with Sam Elkin, Alex Gallagher, who's a poet based in Sydney, and Bobak Saeed, who is currently living in Miami. And this is the first mainstream published anthology of trans and gender diverse writers in Australia. It's got 32 writers, storytellers, as some of the people are graphic artists, 32 storytellers featured in it, from all around the continent known as Australia, all ages, all walks of life. And I suppose the motivation behind this book was that, as you might have noticed, trans people are increasingly in the news, but we're often being talked about rather than getting a chance to talk. So often it's people who know very little about the trans experience, spreading what are often outright lies and misinformation that do so much harm to trans and gender diverse people. And so we not only wanted to kind of speak back to that, but speak on our own terms, because it's certainly been my experience, and I think members of the panel would have shared this, that when trans people are often invited to speak to the media, it's always in response to something that's been said, a transphobic comment. What do you think about J.K. Rowling or Catherine Deves? Which puts us in this kind of reactive posture where we always have to, responding to someone else's statement rather than kind of setting the terms of a conversation ourselves. So our thinking with this anthology was to get a bunch of incredibly talented, brilliant trans and gender diverse thinkers and storytellers and let them write whatever they wanted to write about. So we didn't really set a strict, prescription of, please write about your gender or your childhood trauma or anything like that. We just said, we want you to write what you want to write. And we're pretty happy with the result. It's a really, we think, really rich collection. Some people have really focused on their gender, but other people have, written about other things in their life that are important to them, whether they're cooking or Irish dancing or gardening. And as I said, we've got 3 of our incredibly talented contributors here tonight, which I will introduce you now. So, well, first I'll introduce Sam, because he's on my immediate left. Right. So, Sam Elkin, as I mentioned, is the co-editor of the anthology, but he's also a writer, event producer and radio maker who's based in Naarm. He's published in places like the Griffith Review, the Australian Book Review and the Sydney Review of Books, and he's the host of the extremely excellent 3RRR weekly show Queer View Mirror. And he's also made many podcasts, including a new one that just came out this week, which I highly recommend, about Australian trans history that's been produced by ABC Radio National to coincide with World Pride. And I know how much work's gone into making that, so definitely check that out. Next, we have Jack Nicholls, who is also based in Naarm, is a writer of essays, children's books and speculative fiction. And Jack has a wonderful newsletter in which they publish their incredible essays that you can subscribe to on their website, jacknicholls.net. Next, we have Anastasia Lee, who is a Vietnamese immigrant who's spent half her lives on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. As a woman of trans experience, she's also a radio presenter and an incredibly charismatic and effective advocate for the trans and queer community. And then finally, down the end, we have Liz Duck-Chong, who's come from Sydney, and it's a special treat to have Liz here tonight because all of us Melbourne-based crew have done a few events together already, but this is our first time doing an event with Liz, so it's such a treat to have her. And Liz wears many hats. She's a writer, filmmaker, musician, speaker, photographer and trans advocate based in Sydney. She's published basically everywhere one can be published, including The Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald, Meanjin, Archer, Overland and Kill Your Darlings. She also works as the project coordinator for ACON's Trans Health Equity team, and what I find most impressive is an incredibly talented carpenter as well, because I have no practical skills. So please give all our panellists tonight a really warm welcome. So we're going to start with the readings now. So I believe Liz has offered to go first to read a selection from her piece.
I'm going to read a small excerpt from my piece. I'm going to read something from the beginning. So if you want to hear how it ends, I recommend buying a copy later on. With a plug there for you. And I want to acknowledge that the writing of this piece and also where I live and work is on Gadigal and Wongal land in so-called Sydney. I recently planted a series of garden beds. They're not much to look at, a few square metres of dirt and compost across several containers, each raised on 4 squat timber legs, but I am enraptured with them. Every morning I wake up before my alarm and walk barefoot across the yard to water each stem with care. I run my hands along each of the lettuces, a row of firm green cresting leaves that flank the fast sprouting radishes, and I stick a finger in the dirt to make sure they're not too damp or dry. Across the way, tomatoes and eggplants climb higher each week, racing the spring onions lazily toward the light, all fanging to bear fruit. They stand in the middle of my modest rental backyard in what will simply have to pass as full sun, their groping tendrils spiralling slowly upwards, and I am overcome with wonder. I have never been a good gardener, and I'm constantly on the hunt for shortcuts. I always want to know the easy way out, hoping to one day stumble across the cheat codes for a green thumb, as if it will also cure all of my bad habits, of which I am full. I'm a gossip at heart, I'm a professional catastrophist and an amateur hypochondriac. I can be overbearing, too giving to those who have not asked and too demanding of those who haven't offered. And in particular, I am not a patient person, not really. I am patient least of all with myself. Transition is explained as a timeline, a journey, a war, or a flower waiting to root and blossom into something new and beautiful. But to me, it mostly felt like a waiting game against an enemy that cannot be named. Without realizing, I learned to scour myself for changes in search of any news from the front, any clues of how the tide of battle turned. I remember all too clearly these milestones I obsessed over. My skin softer, but not soft enough. My breast growing, but not grown enough. The shape of my face changing, but not changed enough. I feeling like intently watching a shadow creep across an ornate courtyard. I see doctors and report diligently the latest, the magic that my body weaves in what's yet to come, and they all tell me not to get my hopes up. It feels unfair that this is so common a feeling for trans people, this magical thinking that transposes the joy of future potential into the immediacy of frustration. The ways we change shape, grow and bloom are extraordinary, and yet it becomes so habitual to see only the current moment, and how it doesn't measure up to what we hope to become. The curse of being newly out is to unrelentingly pit ourselves against each other without meaning to, wishing for what everybody else has, other becoming synonymous with better, more beautiful, more real, more trans. These patterns of impatience weave their way early, wearing in paths that compel me to follow, walking trails I didn't realise I helped build. There was a period of years where I stopped walking after feeling a twinge and pinch where my hip bones met my thighs and fearing it spelled an early death. I water in my annuals picking out the fibrous stalks of weeds because I know that not all that grows is good. I am all too aware that any moment a cell could go rogue beneath my skin, a renegade RNA sequence swelling up under the guise of its own importance and hacking away at its surroundings. I've watched up close the way a tumour the size of an ovary or a kidney or a strong feeling even can choke the life from someone with so much of it to start with. I'm fastidious in my habits. I saw doctor after doctor for my hips, trying to engender that balance between playing it cool and asking outright if I'm done for, wondering if this time they'll write private notes in the little column for symptoms like hopeless, weak, time waster. Finally, one doctor sits in silence for a minute, reads my file again, and looks back at me. She asks whether during my pain I noticed my body change shape. Had I considered that this was part of going through puberty again? She's the first doctor to consider that hormones might do more than make me irritable, that my body might be capable of growing more than just diminutive tits and pimples. She prescribes me some painkillers to bridge the fiction of fertility my body writes, and I walk home, wondering what other secrets I'm yet to birth. ...
Thank you so much, Liz. And then now we're going to hear from Jack.
Hello, hello. My piece is called Memento Moratorium. It is near the back of the book, and I've lost it, but I will find it. And I studied history at school and wanted to, I think, kind of write a slightly historical piece to kind of remember the time only 20 years ago when things were very different to how they are now. And that is what my piece is about. Some days it seems that trans people, especially trans women, are all that our culture wants to talk about. Depending on your perspective, we are the boogeyman in the bathroom or the proud face of social justice. But as a trans feminine person who did not medically transition, I find the new visibility of the trans community as a mixed blessing, and the speed of social change has given me whiplash. Ever since the day I had been dragged out of the girls' bathroom at kindergarten, I had understood that to mention my gender dysphoria would be social suicide. So for 17 years, I kept my mouth shut and shoplifted lipstick, until in 2003, the pressure exploded. Soon after, I washed up at the Monash Gender Clinic for consultations with Dr. Herbert Bertie Bauer. Talking to Bertie was the closest I can imagine to sitting down with Freud himself. 60 years in Melbourne had not expunged the Viennese drawl from Bertie's vows or his old world courtesy. He sported a checkered flat cap, pocket handkerchief, and silvery moustache. He looked to be nearly 90, and as it turned out, he was. Bertie was the 6th psychologist my despairing parents had sent me to, but the first to take my gender dysphoria seriously. He was an empathic man who had helped save hundreds of trans people from self-harm and despair. His clinic, which since 1975 had advertised itself as the only public gender dysphoria service in the whole of the Southern Hemisphere, was only 15 kilometres from my house in Melbourne. In 2003, I was incredibly lucky to be there. And that says a lot about 2003. I have no memory of Bertie's rooms, only his lined face and the quiet tick of a clock, marking each minute that testosterone was ravaging my body. I remember Bertie asking me if I was a girl, and the question seemed as impossible to answer then as now. I knew that I wanted to be a girl, but I was wary about claiming to be the one thing I knew so painfully I was not. Bertie showed me images of ambiguous social interactions. Here was a clean-cut man standing at the foot of a sleeping woman's bed. And how did that make me feel? Threatened, I said. Vile. Or he's a vampire. A boyfriend might stand beside the sleeping woman, but only a vampire would stand at the end of her bed. Fascinating, Bertie said, pen scratching. Vampires led on to my other interests, movies, video games, not what Bertie considered the most feminine pursuits. He seemed surprised I'd chosen to wear tight girls' jeans rather than a dress. Finally, we went full Freud and got to the nub of the issue. Tell me about your penis. Would you like to have it surgically removed? I looked down at my crotch. I'd never loved penises. The way the foreskin retracts makes me think of H.R. Geiger's designs for the Alien franchise. But nor had I ever wanted to take a scalpel to my own. I wasn't trans because I obsessed over my genitalia or longed for silky dresses. I was trans because I was trans. I cautiously said that I could take or leave castration, and he looked disappointed. So I added, I'd quite like breasts. Breasts? And a penis? Asked Bertie. And I felt the shame at having voiced a perversion. Today we say that a trans woman does not become a woman. She always was a woman. But 20 years ago, gender dysphoria was an illness that was cured by moving cleanly from one state of being to another. Today I was Jack. Tomorrow I could be someone else, but only with hormones and ultimately the snip, memorably characterized by my best friend as cutting off your meat and 2 veg. But it wasn't medical intervention that most concerned me. Given the transphobia of the community, it was assumed for good reason that transitioning meant going stealth, changing your name, hiding your history. That was the real snip on offer to trans people, and that idea unsettled me. A moratorium, Bertie suggested at the family conference following these interviews. Jack seems ambivalent. I think they are very young and not quite ready to step over the line to being a woman. My mother sobbed. My father nodded in relief. I thought that was unfair. I did want to be a woman. I just didn't want to give up video games and take up embroidery.
Thanks so much, Jack. And now our final speaker, Anastasia.
Okay. I'm just going to read out a few excerpts from my writing. Always a delight and good laugh whenever I listen to yours, Jack. All right. So in Australia, I was surprised to find that every butcher and fishmonger served the same cuts of meat and food and seafood. I was used to uniformity in the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, but I was surprised to find that the capitalist system in Australia had resulted in this strange culinary uniformity. When I walked the streets of Melbourne at night, I was confused to find that most restaurants and cafes had already shut by 9 p.m. In Vietnam, we could go out eating and drinking at any time of the night. I soon fell for the pleasure of juicy, delicious burgers from McDonald's and Hungry Jack's, however, which reminded me of American movies. When I went shopping, I was dazzled by the plethora of food in the supermarkets, all organized neatly in colorful plastic packaging. I did not love the food inside the packages, however, and as time went by, I started to resent soggy Fruit Loops and white bread smeared in goo for breakfast. I yearned for the aniseed heavy pho made by Auntie Seven and the young charcoal ginger infused broth prepared by Uncle Ten in a small market store a few streets away from my home in Vietnam. We are poor, but we feast the king. I longed to eat broken rice and pork chops in the morning, followed by a crude pork banh mi roll, washed down by a warm cup of pandan fragrance homemade soy milk for lunch. Yeah, so just my writing is it's a journey about food because I love food and in a way an homage to the mothers before me and in some one way or another is how we connect with our foremothers really. Dot dot. When I was 18, I moved out of my relatives' house and enrolled in an Australian university. I developed a huge crush on my muscular lecturer who had koi fish and dragon etched onto his arms. I also felt jealous when beautiful young women who looked like Victoria's Secret models walked past me with their boyfriends. I felt so confused about who I was. In Vietnam, I was raised to believe that homosexuals were degenerates who spread death and diseases. People in my own family would laugh and spit at them, which caused me great pain, as I knew there was something different about me too. I was naturally rebellious and flamboyant, but had been too frightened and paranoid at home to accept to myself that I was attracted to men, let alone to explore my sexuality with others. I did not understand my gender identity or my sexuality at all, and could not find any resources to help me. Instead, I spent even more time moving between my chopping board and a simmering pot of broth to soothe my anxiety, experimenting with new recipes. Eventually, I got up the courage to experience with other areas of my life. I went on a couple of first dates with men, but was totally clueless. My naivete from my conservative upbringing meant that I had little understanding of sex and romance, which led to a myriad of heartbreaks. Back in Vietnam, perhaps due to the legacy of imperialism and ensuing economic devastation, the intimate relationships I witnessed were highly codependent and reliant. And it took me a long time to understand that the men I wanted to be with were not seeking that kind of relationship. I was always looking for a savior to distract me from all the agonies deep within myself. But whenever I was down, between endless work and study, my recipes and culinary trials were always there to comfort me. And then, now this is a bittersweet moment. When I was able to access gender-affirming hormones, my life started to change so much. I felt more comfortable and at peace with my body. Men at work started to talk down to me and blatantly underestimate my intellect, despite my qualifications. They explained to me everything I knew. I soon learned that expressing my opinions and values in the workplace, in the way that men did, would lead me to be being labeled difficult to work with. And after growing up in a misogynistic, fat-phobic society, I still continue to work towards self-love and pride in my curvy hips and thighs. When I reflect upon my upbringing in Vietnam, I think a lot about my mother and grandmother. Before I embraced my womanhood, I could not begin to understand the kinds of things they went through and the intergenerational trauma that had passed through them. As strong women in a deeply patriarchal society, they did their best with the love and care etched on their sleeves, no matter how oppressive their words could come across at times. In my life today, I honor my culture and ancestors through the food that I make and through the love that I provide to my own queer community here in Melbourne. And after this, I actually include a childhood recipes. Is pineapple and tomato soup. You can have it with either seafood and tofu. It's up to you. It's quite popular amongst the Southeast Asian pelagos as well. So, yeah, then that's something you can take with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Anastasia. I hope those short extracts have whetted your appetite to read more, and in Anastasia's case, literally whetted your appetite to cook her recipe. So Liz, I might go back to your piece. Gardening is sort of a motif throughout your discussion of changing bodies, changing identities. Why did you choose that sort of lens to focus your piece on? Why gardening?
I feel like there's two core reasons, and the
Yeah.
first one is that it is a deeply locked down piece of writing.
True.
It's all about staying in my backyard and going for walks around my neighborhood and thinking way too hard, which I feel like was my 2020. So it was very, very moment in time. But there was also something a little bit, I think, rebelling against, I think, a very tidy and like cut flowers approach to how we think about like not just transition but also kind of like feminized gender as being like very floral and being very like blossoming and growing and sprouting and all of these kinds of very simultaneously fecund but also like very neat ways of thinking about like one day you'll grow into a vase of beautiful flowers, and kind of rebelling against that idea through my own journey of like wanting to initially be this very idealized woman that I think is a very kind of, if not a common trans experience, or a common kind of trans understanding of what we should or kind of are required to experience, to being like, I don't know, I think it needs to be a bit messier. I used the phrase later on in the piece, seeking out a rewilding of gender, and that's kind of like, I'm just like, just put that on my tombstone. That's all I'm looking for.
Love that. And Jack, in your piece, a lot of it is, discussion of your encounter with the gender clinic in 2003, 20 years ago now, which is confronting to realise. If you could go back in time, what would you tell that earlier version of yourself about gender, or just how to be
I
a
think the
person?
main thing I would say is you know what's going on better than they do.
Yeah.
Like, there's just, when you're a kid, you sort of assume that the adult has knowledge and skill and you apply to them. But in this case, none of the people I was talking to were trans, which is fine, but like, they were kind of groping in the dark to understand how I was feeling, and that's why they were probably using these kind of ridiculous shorthand things to try and tick boxes so they could try and understand something that is very internal. So I would say, don't pay too much attention to what they say, though, they do control the drugs. And also you can live a much broader life than you might think, in not just gender-wise, like in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
I think most people might be able to say that to their younger self.
Yeah.
Like, you're going to have more options than you realise once you get out of school.
Yeah. Great advice. And Anastasia, I love the role of food in your piece and the way, you talk about cooking and food as sort of a comfort when you were first in Australia and in the early stages of your transition. I was wondering, what is your relationship to cooking like these days? Like, does it still play a pivotal role in your life, or has it evolved?
It has evolved to manyfold, because I've spent more of my life in Australia than I have in Vietnam. And unfortunately, due to my fractured relationship with my family, and I can't go back to my country, and I have to seek refuge here. So for me, it has evolved into this sort of amalgamation of my own culture, of my own extraction of whatever Australia identifies as, and my own childhood. But all of these beautiful, I sieved through my memories and picked out the sweetest pieces actually, and incorporated into my cooking. So I've made a lot more fusion food, and cooking and eating in general reflects a lot about your life and the people you have interaction with. And so, it has grown to be fairly fusiony in a way. I would have fish sauce in my pasta sauces, especially when it concerns seafood, because it's wonderful, and it's one way for me to channel my creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. And Sam, we might bring you in, because you've been sitting there quietly for a while, and see if you can offer an editorial perspective on this book. It's obviously been something we've been working on for quite a few years. What does it mean to you to have edited this book, Nothing to Hide?
Well, yeah, I mean, to state the obvious, it was a real honour to work on this collection. You know, bringing a project that was just a kind of tender idea out in the world through to fruition is very satisfying, and I think that the collection has done a fine job of capturing a moment in time and a number of different conversations that are going on, and a number of different ways that people are expressing their experience of gender and sexuality. You know, there's pieces in this collection that talk explicitly about sex, some that talk about things like dancing. There's a really strong contribution of a range of First Nations contributors in this book, which is something that we were both really eager to make sure happened, and the other editors were as well. And it's a really beautiful thing to have out in the world, and to have been able to kind of shepherd that. You know, I think, like a lot of trans people, when, you know, you're in the earlier stages of transitioning, as I was, you know, searching for answers, searching for things that didn't necessarily exist, and I just thought, oh, I wish a book like this existed. So to have been able to participate in the process of making that happen is, you know, a real honour, and I don't think, you know, anything will beat it in that sense. Yeah.
Thanks. And you mentioned this as a document of a particular moment in time. I'm interested in how you'd characterise that moment in time. Like, where do you think we are in the trans history of Australia?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, having just done a trans history podcast, I have had a lot of time to think about the history of trans and gender diverse people in so-called Australia, and how that we talk about our bodies and our identities. And, you know, there's been an incredible change. And when you take that longer view, you can understand why there's some, you know, growing pains around how people are accepting us and understanding us, and that, you know, language is always changing, and that a term that might have been considered to be, you know, very fashionable and in like 20 years ago is now considered out. And, you know, somebody who's about to turn 40, I feel very, very much that I'm on the precipice of being the person that's out after having been in. And yeah, so it's interesting to take that longer view, and I think that this book almost in a way sort of, I feel like, came out a little bit before the backlash. Like, I don't want to sort of be a downer, but I do feel like, for a while there was a great desire, you know, when your book came out and other books came out at the same time, I felt like there was this real wave of positive representation happening. And yeah, I don't know if it's just my mood or mental health or what I'm focusing on in the media at the moment, but I do feel like there's been a bit of a counterpunch in the media, certainly with the New York Times and whatnot. And yeah, I do sort of feel like this book almost harks back to happier days in a way. But,
The
you know,
happy days of lockdown.
that's right. Back in the good old days where we couldn't leave the house. But yeah, things go back and forth and things change. And, you know, the thing that I want to do as a person is positively contribute to culture and provide different perspectives and opportunities to speak their truth. And, you know, I think this collection does that, and I hope that it means something in that broader discussion.
Thanks. And I'm interested to hear that the other three, what you think about this question of, you know, the moment we're in terms of trans history, trans culture, what's happening. I mean, I know, Liz, you do a lot of work in this space, so I can think you'd have some thoughts.
I definitely mirror a feeling of like question mark, interrobang, tumultuousness kind of vibes. I don't know. I think it's a simple answer. I definitely feel like this collection, I think, feels like something that I hope like bodes well for kind of how we continue to look into like trans art and trans thinking, but it also kind of feels like in one sense, it happened as early as it could have as well. Like, there's been lots of kind of really like pivotal trans art that's happened, but for it to be so collected and so dense with that, I kind of feel like, yeah, it's wonderful and amazing that you put it together, but it also feels like this is like the earliest that we could have like gotten this through. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. What about Jack or Anastasia? Do you have any thoughts about this moment that we're in?
I mean, to me, trans history, I mean, we have always been part of history, you know. Recently, I've got the privilege to confirm my knowledge with somebody from the University of Glasgow, and they are an archaeologist, and she talked to me how she found queerness accidentally upon her research. It's just that certain, you know, institution that dictates fundings and everything kind of did not want to approve that sort of theory that queerness have always been prevalent throughout humanity. So to me, it's so we have lost our power, of course, through, you know, for the past maybe 2-3 millennia. We have started to reclaim it and found our own sovereignty through our, you know, through funding each other through the internet and supporting each other through all these, just finding our own power through all this hatred. But at the same time, we kind of regress ourselves a bit because, unfortunately, many of us, due to collateral trauma and collective trauma, a lot of us, we still operate from, we still centralize our passion and our motivation for activism around rage and wrath, which is not sustainable. And then there would be others who have found humanity through our own identities, and that kind of creates some kind of friction. So it has been a bit of a tug of war within our own community. But yeah, we are moving forward slightly in a way, and I guess we cannot fully reclaim and regain our power when sexism is still there, when discrimination is still there, because at the end of the day, you know, transphobia is an aspect of, you know, sexism and misogyny especially, so yeah.
So we just need to bring down the patriarchy as well.
Yeah, essentially, and talk more about the impact, the tremendous impact that colonization has on global culture in general as well. So yeah.
Yeah. So take down the patriarchy and white supremacy, and then we might be getting somewhere.
Yeah, we might be getting somewhere. And of course, we can't do that. People, as a person of color like myself, I mean, I've pondered and I reflect on myself every single day and every night. And at the end of the day, it actually takes the people in power, which are people who are not of color, or people who are more like Caucasian and white, who actually benefit a lot from colonization, to acknowledge and to help us achieving equality. Yeah. Thank you.
Jack, because your piece, you know, as we said, is about 2003, it starts there. How would you characterise the difference you've seen in the last 20 years?
I have so many thoughts.
Yeah.
I think that if you take like a really long view of it, then what's happening, first of all, I think that something Anastasia said about the internet is the primary driver of trans culture, which is the internet allowed a very secret subculture to find each other, and that, as with neo-Nazis, had a huge explosion in their courage and willingness to be out and about. I think from the really long view, you can see that this sort of flourishing of trans culture is a continuation of something that's been happening for about 80 or 100 years, this kind of shift further and further away from these collective social ideas under like the church or the government into more and more celebration of the individual. So people they stopped, not all people, a lot of people sort of started abandoning the morality of the church, and then and a lot of women then sort of started developing feminism and abandoning this idea of what a woman should be. And now, this century, people are abandoning ideas of what they should be just at all in their gender. And how that will play out in the long run, I don't know, but I would say our moment will be seen one of two ways, depending what happens. Either maybe we're all put in concentration camps and there's climate collapse and civilization falls apart, and then kind of feudal militaristic societies pull back together, and then they'll say things like, you don't want to be like the old people, the men wore dresses and then the seas rose up, and will be like a cautionary tale.
Oh, so we will have caused climate change.
I think there'll be some stuff. If you look at like the way like the 18th century talked about the Romans, it was like they drank too much and had sex with their cousins, and then it was all over. But
You heard it here first, people. Trans people cause climate collapse.
But if we have a more positive future where this kind of shift towards individual freedom continues, then I think the only thing they'll be remembered for is this kind of cute nostalgia of like people thought that was worth commenting on.
Yeah.
And I really look forward to getting even older and then watching like period movies from this period where they and we'll have a trans person in the background because that was very cool then. And I would hope for a future where everyone is just exploring their identity without it being an issue.
Can I just also say, I feel like there is such a power in how we think about this and approach this in understanding or like beginning to understand trans history. Like I think the work of like having a historical perspective of transness and trans people suddenly I think places the concerns and the frictions and the things that are happening today, which are very real, but places them in a context of much, much longer than kind of our lives have been, and that they're struggles that have happened over a long period of time. Like, I often think about, like, I've been broadly affirming my gender for, like, 13 to 15 years, which feels like forever in trans time, but it's also, like, such a small window of time compared to, like, how long trans people have existed, which is, like, kind of forever. And I take a huge amount of, like, solidarity from that, like, even if it's not spoken or known explicitly, like, we're building on all of that, and we continue to, and kind of have continued to exist despite extreme oppression in many cases. And I don't know, I think there's something, like, about the fact that we keep going, which is, like, really, really heartening.
Yeah, that resilience of despite everything the world throws at us.
Yeah.
But still here.
Something else about this time I think is really interesting from what Anastasia was talking about, like bringing on the patriarchy and things. I think that's reflective of a lot of trans discourse, which is because in relatively recent time, most us, people our age, we grew up with some level of oppression, even if it was in our heads or it was like being beaten up on the street, whatever it was, and that drives people to position themselves counterculturally, like we're outsiders. And so I think you've got a lot of quite radical trans people now, which is awesome. But maybe a sort of funny side effect of life becoming so much easier for us is in like 20 years, you'll have really conservative, like, trans people running for the National Party or something.
Like a lot of Caitlyn Jenners running.
Yeah, because they've had like, because of people, not so much me, people the generation before us maybe who really fought for a freedom that younger people now have. They have the freedom to not want to change the world, which would be, I guess, cool.
Yeah.
Sad as well.
Like, I'm excited / conflicted about celebrating our first transgender Prime Minister for the Liberal Party.
Yeah. Sadly, I can't actually see that. Now, time is rapidly getting away from us, so I'm just going to start thinking about your questions, getting them ready. I'm going to ask the panel one more question that we'll just do a quick rip around. I'd love to ask each of you, what do you hope readers, cis readers or trans readers or both, get out of this book, reading your words and the words of other amazing trans writers? Sam?
Well, somebody who loves to read, I just always want books to spark more books. So, for anybody who reads it, I hope it sparks your own creativity and curiosity and that create more interesting culture that I can absorb.
Yeah. So go and write a book.
Yeah, at minimum. Yes.
Yeah. Jack?
I hope people will be surprised to find that our lives are not all sad, and there's lots of humour and good stuff in this book.
Yeah, for me, I just hope that we all can find the inner child and keep being inquisitive and keep asking questions and constantly unpacking everything we learn through our current education system, because they don't cover everything. So yeah, that's what I hope.
Fantastic.
I feel like one of the things I've gotten from this collection and from trans art so broadly is how dedicated people are to find beauty in so many aspects of our lives, and I really hope it inspires you to not only see that but also take time to think about where those aspects are in your own lives as well and reflect really lovingly on them. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Well, we're now going to open up to questions. I think we've got a roving mic here. And we'd love to hear from you. You can direct a question to the whole panel or to someone in particular. Please don't be shy. I feel like there's a question. Oh, there's one.
I ask a question as a trans, non-binary human myself. I find myself, I'm a very sensitive being, and I find it hard sometimes to deal with people's hate I'm just embracing my authentic self and trying to be a good influence in life and, share love. And it's hard sometimes for me to deal when people are hateful toward me, because I don't hold hate for anyone. I don't care what you do. If you're not hurting someone, I'm not going to judge you. So I feel like I struggle a little bit, and I wanted your advice of how to deal with those situations of hate from random people in the world.
Thanks for that question.
I think what I would remember is they don't actually hate you. Like, they hate something they've been told to hate. It's a sort of vague cultural idea, and it's kind of, it's unpleasant when it's directed to you, but it's not saying anything about you as a person. And a lot of people, I guess, have that in one aspect of their life or another. It's not universal, but a common human thing that we struggle with.
So for me, because I work as a disability service support worker, and of course, I still have to perform duty of care to people who actually have swastika tattoos all over their arms. And as soon as they see a person of non-Caucasian background, then they would start putting the mask on and doing all those things. And I've operated from rage before. I've operated from pain before for quite some time. I can only share with you just my own personal perspective, is that what you have got is a blessing. So focus on the blessing. You, despite everything you need to achieve as a human, or expected to do as a human being, like working and contribute and, breathing and maintain your health and well-being, just so that you can be part of this economy, you have time to cultivate and find pieces of yourself. And you've been able to find empathy within everything you do to get to this point. So focus on that blessing and feel sorry for them. I used to be quite hateful, like I wish they would just die, but but again, unfortunately, it's just something, it's still very unfair out there. Through my activism, I hear a lot of things that trans people, non-binary people have to go through on a daily basis, and yet we still have to respect the values and beliefs of others. So I guess, just lead by example, show them that they have failed what they preach us to do. So yeah.
I totally understand that, that feeling of not feeling hateful, but how do you respond to it? And the only thing I've come up with so far is to respond with love, but somewhere else. And so take that. You can like ignore them. They can, you know, whatever. But like receiving that and then taking that feeling and going, I'm going to love someone else more because of this. And pushing that energy into a better place, and like maybe in a holistic butterfly effect kind of way, it might come back to them and they'll be wonderful in the future, and maybe they won't, and someone else will just be loved, and that's a really nice takeaway.
I feel like I'm in this strange position when I think about that kind of question, that because, like, as a result of having transitioned to be presenting as a sort of male-bodied white person in this country, I feel like actually in a lot of ways the red carpet has been rolled out for me for the first time in my life, whereas, you know, in the 90s and the 2000s, you know, when I came of age, like I was really like suffered from, you know, lesbophobia and homophobia and sexism, and, you know, these things were a really big part of my life, and it was only sort of like crossing over and realising that that's not a part of my life anymore that I realised how much, you know, it did affect me, and it affected my whole world outlook and my self-esteem and, you know, my sense of safety in the world. And yeah, I do feel like I'm in a strange position now where, you know, on the one hand I can read articles in the paper and I can see that there's, you know, a concerted campaign to, you know, suppress or eliminate people like me in a way, but then in an everyday context, actually people are like, oh, you're so clever, what do you have to say, in a way that has never been my experience before. So it's a strange mental loop that I get into. But yeah, I have to say that in my everyday life, I've never been treated better, which is a bit of a mind-bending equation. So I try and enjoy that without getting used to it, and try and pass the mic to others as much as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The real reason people transition is just to get male privilege.
That's right.
No. Are there any other questions? One, yeah?
Hi, so I do have a question, but it will probably appear in like a stream of consciousness, so just bear with me. So I'm a high school teacher, and sort of working in the education system as someone who is also genderqueer, but also not necessarily out to staff and, you know, most students, is obviously in its own kind of challenge. But I feel like there are a lot of things that we are taught as educators that are quite by the book in terms of how we are supposed to support, you know, not just queer kids, but genderqueer kids and trans kids. But I feel like to a point, you know, there's only so much that we are told that we should do, and there are a lot of things that we shouldn't do. And I feel like maybe that's not quite enough. I don't really know. I feel like there are so many supports that we can sort of provide to these, you know, children, not necessarily just as educators, but as just people. And I guess out of all of that, my question would be, what sort of supports would you have wanted to see, or would you like to see?
Great question. Does anyone want to tackle it?
I mean, I spent half my life in Vietnam, where the education system is vastly different from Australian one. But one way or another, it's still about force feeding. It's selectively approved knowledge to me. I wish that, you know, educators can start seeing themselves as not a force feeder, but more like a guide. Instead of, like, you know, cramming all these numbers and all these standardized testing to the younger generation, they just create a more supportive environment so that everybody can start questioning a bit more. just keep being inquisitive, and because that's how you access to the best part of yourself, just by keep on questioning, keep on reflecting. So yeah, just maybe focus more on self-development, self-awareness. We don't have enough of that. We constantly tell children, oh, that's not okay. But then, oh, it's not okay for you to throw a tantrum, but it's just a normal human response to trauma and, things that upset us. So it's just normal. So just maybe keep validating the person's feelings and don't quickly, and maybe just guide. I wish I had somebody to guide me, like, it's okay for you to not understand your emotion at this point in time. You will come to terms with it in the future. But for now, just explore it. So that's something I wish that we could provide to the younger generation.
I think that is a very normal way to approach like young people's like emotional understandings and like kind of like conceptual and social understandings, is that you have time to figure it out. But then when we look at their gender, we go, but you kind of need to have figured that out already so that we can know how to respond to this. And allowing for that exploratory space, I think, is in the same way as we do for so many other aspects of young people's lives, I think. I feel like the other aspect for me, which it sounds like, say, something that you're doing by like asking and thinking about it, is making it something that there's a possibility for. I think I often think back on how white my early schooling was, as kind of like a corollary of that, in terms of like the way we talked about the books that we read and the art that we engaged with was all really, really white. And so when we did kind of like Aboriginal Month or something like that, it kind of placed it in a huge contrast that we thought about as different as we were growing up, rather than kind of an exploration of like art across culture that didn't center any perspective. And I would say the same for like our understanding of gender, like including books by trans and gender diverse authors in amongst other books, and kind of just making it a part of young people's understanding that there are people who have these experiences and share them, and don't share them and just write other things and engage in other things, that allows it to be one understanding and possibility, I think.
Yeah, I have not been to school for 20 years, so I'm sure it has changed, but when I think about my schooling, and I think until recently at least, I think there's this idea that even when there are supports for trans people or people with any issue, they have to be proactive about finding it. Like, they have to go, I'm a freak, is there something you can do for me? And that's really hard for a kid, especially when they might not be sure. So maybe if you can bring stuff to all the kids and be like, hey, this is a book by a trans person, and this is what being trans is like, and maybe there's someone in that class that's really helpful for, but they're not ready to ask for that. And even if there's not, well, it's good for everyone to learn.
And perhaps like start using like gender neutral pronouns and to refer to things on a daily basis. And and at the end of the day, I think we are all dictated by our subconsciousness, which is about 90 to 95% of our action is dictated by the subconsciousness. And when we are younger, we are less influenced by all of these conscious and logical conditioning. So just validate them and help them to understand. And thank you for coming out to us as well.
Yeah. And did you want to add something? Oh, I'd also say, if you said you identify as genderqueer yourself, I mean, like you are this person. Like, so I'd say, trust your gut and think about what you would have wanted. As even if you're not out, I mean, if that's who you know yourself to be, that's who you are. And so you become an expert. So, yeah, just look within.
I think a really powerful tool for schools, but many, many spaces that I think is underutilised, is a gay-straight alliance, or an equivalent kind of space where you are creating a space of explicit inclusion without explicit coming out. And I think that is a really powerful thing, where people can not have to identify, divulge, anything like that, but know that either themselves or others around them are celebrated. I think it's a very powerful thing, even if it's just like lunch once a month or something like that, where people can just be celebrated.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly the first trans culture I seriously engaged with, I was just as an ally.
Absolutely.
I was just interested as an ally, and then it turned out there was something a bit more to it. Do we have one final question? There's one here. I think there's a mic just coming, sorry. Yeah.
As a much older person, I like to think, your point, Steve, of great optimism. Like, I look back 60 years ago and people like me were run out of a town, basically, because we were pregnant. Now, you know, each 10 years I look back, there's been, probably not if you're in the skin of the person, I don't remember thinking that when I was 17, but there's been great strides in what's happened. Like, I really don't think there were those sort of strides in the 70 years before that. And I think the internet, our access to books, all sorts of things, it's really easy to forget how quickly that's happened. And I am so glad for you that, well, I'm glad for everybody that cops it bad, but I think most people cop it bad at some point of their growing up. Now, it's more difficult for some, but I think sometimes we need to look back at the strides we have made and the optimism we can look forward to. So well done.
Thank you.
And well done, Anne-Marie, another star.
Thank you.
And I think I just want to echo your point that I think, you know, increasing celebration of trans people liberates everyone, because, you know, the gender binary is a trap for everyone, whether you're cis or trans. So I think, you know, it's important to keep coming back to not seeing this as, you know, a niche issue for the small number of trans people. But this is about collective liberation. This is all of us getting freer to live and dress and act how we want, and, you know, see gender exploration as a joyful, playful thing rather than something to be feared. So I think we are running out of time, so we might have to end there, but we're going to be sticking around to sign some books. So if you have any burning questions, you can come over and ask us there. We'd love to speak to you and have a bit of a chat while signing a book. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. Thank you again to Anne-Marie for organising and the Library Museum for hosting. And thanks for being such a wonderful audience. Please congratulate our wonderful contributors again.
Yes.